So I am very honored and privileged to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Julio Cammarota. He is an associate professor, multicultural education at Iowa State University. His research focuses on the participation action research on Latinx youth, academic achievement in our education system. He has published many articles on cultural education and the relationships with the Latinx population. Again, I heard him speak before, and he is awesome. Dr. Julio Cammarota.
Thank you. Thank you. So that was a wonderful introduction. I'd like to thank Gear Up and thank Elizabeth for inviting me, having me speak here. I know this is at the end part of the day. I'm so happy that you're still hanging out, right? You probably heard talks and presentations all throughout the day. So I promise you, we'll have fun, okay? Some of the stuff might get serious at times. You might feel a little bit uncomfortable, but we'll have fun. We'll end it in a real fun way, a joyous way. So I'm going to talk to you about social justice in education. So social justice in education and also social justice in youth development. I don't know if you're aware, but a lot of the work that we do with young people comes from ideas embedded in youth development. So I'm going to talk to you about some of these ideas. So most of my comments, when I say students, I'm referring to urban youth, youth of color, and particularly Latinx youth. That's a lot of my work is around that, around Latinx youth or urban youth. So why social justice in education? Why? Why should we have social justice in education or social justice in youth development? That's an important question because in most cases we're so focused on, which is really very important, we're so focused on helping students achieve, right? We have a very technical approach sometimes. Achievement is good, achievement is great, but we're at a particular climate right now where young people need to heal, right? Particularly marginalized youth. Their identities, right, are under attack, right? They experience different ruptures in their identities, their social identities. So social justice in education and youth development is about healing. It's about healing those identities, but not only that, healing the community context as well. Because the reason why young people have these fractured identities is because the context in which they live is toxic. In many cases, it's very toxic. So we're going to get into all of that. So before we had social justice in urban education or in youth development, there was a problem-based discourse. You'd have to go back to the 1960s to a sociologist by the name of Coleman, and he did a report in the 1968. And he basically said, to summarize this report, that urban youth are the problem, and they need to be fixed. So what do you think, let's go back to the 1960s, when this report came out, what do you assume those problems were, that urban youth presented problems? What were they? Okay, we have to have an agreement. You have to participate. This is not going to work if you don't participate. So I'm going to ask a lot of questions. So you got to participate, and you got to answer the questions. So do we have an agreement? Okay. So back again. What do you think, what do you assume those problems were back in the 1960s in the Coleman report? The problems, as I said, that report said that urban youth are the problem that need to be fixed. So what were those problems? Well, that's more contextual. They actually said the youth themselves are a problem. So think of what sort of their behavior. Yes, behavior. Maladaptive behavior, right? violent behavior, aggressiveness, language, right? The kind of language that they use. So these are some of the problems that they thought that needed to be fixed. So the problem-based approach is consonant with deficit thinking or the deficit model of thinking. Are you familiar with this idea of deficit thinking? Are any of you familiar with it? Yes? So it's the basic assumption that young people, particularly young people of color, are in deficit. They're deficient in proper culture, proper values, right? Proper language. So the idea in order to fix the problem was to assimilate young people into the white middle class or upper class culture. So what may be the problems? I know these are sort of simple questions, but it's very important that we answer these questions and name them. So what's the problem with assimilation? You lose identity, right? What are some other concerns around assimilation? There's something wrong with you. The knowledge that you have isn't worth anything, right? What's that? Right. 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 So the thing is, we have roundly critiqued, and you did a wonderful job here, critiqued this model, this problem-based approach, and the solution of assimilation. We've critiqued it, but it's still prevalent. It still exists. We may have to go back a few years, but Carrie mentioned in her presentation, Carrie Romo, Ruby Payne. I don't know if any of you know Ruby Payne, but that was the flavor of the time. Less than, I would say, about 10 years ago, Carrie? About 10 years ago. That was the flavor. And the assumption was that poor students were a problem. And the problem was they didn't have the right values, the right culture, right? And we as educators needed to change them so that they would have the right culture and values. So, I would say by the 1990s, in youth development and in urban education, things shifted. Moved from a problem-based approach to a possibilities-based approach, what we call positive youth development. How many of you in here actually work in youth development? Does anyone? And you work in education. You work? So you must have heard positive youth development. It's the dominant paradigm in youth development. This idea that young people have access to assets within their own community, right? Within their own community. And these assets can be used to solve problems. So my next question is, what are these assets? What do you think they are? Role models, like social relationships. What did you say? Global perspective. Oh, did you read my work? Oh. So what else? What other assets? There are a lot. Multiple languages. What else? Technology. A sense of community, sense of belonging, right? So those are just some of the assets. We'll actually talk more about assets in a minute. But the problem-based approach, as I said earlier, relies on having young people have access to community assets, and these assets are used to solve problems. So in positive youth development, the idea is to provide young people with supports and opportunities that highlight the assets that they have or have access to. Actually, both paradigms, the problem-based paradigm and the possibility-based paradigm, they have something right in both of them. The problem-based one, urban youth are not the problem. They experience problems. And we can't over-romanticize young people of color and say that they have all these wonderful assets. They experience really serious problems, right? Problems that lead to high levels of stress, high levels of anxiety. The possibilities, yes, there are assets, but I bet you, and I know, a lot of young people are unfamiliar with the assets that they have, right? Say, for instance, language. You have a young person whose first language is Spanish. This is common to the research that I have done. But a young person can go out in society or in school and will be told numerous occasions to not speak Spanish because you're in America, you should speak English. So what do you think that does? What effect does that have on the person that, the young person that speaks Spanish? Right. It's degrading to who they are. And they no longer see Spanish as an asset, which it is, particularly in this world. They no longer see it. They no longer see it as a source of knowledge, which it is. So the important question that I hope to answer throughout this talk is, how do marginalized youth understand what assets are available to them? How does that happen? How do they become aware of that? So in about 2002, myself and another colleague of mine, Sean Ginwright, we actually developed a model, a social justice youth development model. And it's built on three sets of awarenesses. One is awareness of self, awareness of one's identity. The other is a community context, understanding your community. What are both the social and economic toxins in your community, and what are the assets in your community? And then lastly, global, a global awareness. So understanding that there are people outside of your own community that are also experiencing oppression or suffering. And it's important to empathize or be in solidarity with people outside of your own community. 3 levels of awareness that would then help young people to heal. They would gain a sense of hope by being in these different areas of awareness: self, community, and global. So here's what it graphically looks like. So they're areas, they're circles. It's different than the traditional development models, right? Everyone's familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? Well, this is different than a hierarchy, right? All the areas are integrated. All the areas should happen simultaneously, be connected to one another. So let's start off with the self. So awareness of self. So this is this idea that young people, particularly marginalized youth, need to be aware of their own social identities and have a healthy perspective of who they are. There are multiple negative representations of marginalized youth. Where do they come from? Media. Where else? School. Community. What's that? Their peers, okay? Self-talk. Internalized messages, yes. Right? It goes as high up as the White House, right? Highest public official in the land is constantly saying negative things, right? So they're bombarded by it. So what happens is a lowering of self-esteem, there's a lowering of confidence, and there's a loss of hope. That is where, when you lose hope, that's when you see high levels of stress and anxiety come in. And it leads to mental health issues. It affects your well-being when you lose hope. So it's important to not only be aware of oneself and aware of one's own identity, but be aware of your community, the community context. Now, I'm thinking of community in a very broad sense, right? I'm not thinking of community just as the home, right? The home, there could be some problems within the home, but you have to think that whatever problems in the home are symptoms of larger conditions in the community, right? What social psychologists call social and economic toxins. So what might be some social and economic toxins that will affect young people? What might they be? Unemployment, yes. Racism, various forms of discrimination, various forms of oppression in their own lived context. What else? Instability in the home, but that could be a symptom of a larger context. Substance abuse, once again, that's another symptom. Misrepresentation, the yes, exactly. You know, I've worked with young people for a very long time, and one time we were doing this very innovative social justice course at a high school, and the young people wanted to talk about this course at their school because it was only one of its kind throughout the district, only one of its kind. So they did a press release, they gathered, they were going to show the work that they were doing. None of the press showed up. If they would have gone and broke a window, press would have showed up, right? It's just, I don't know. But right, the way the media represents young people, there's a tendency to focus on the negative. So, how many of you know this term, funds of knowledge? Right? Funds of knowledge. It's this idea, comes from some colleagues of mine in the University of Arizona. It's this idea that more marginalized communities actually have a wealth or funds of knowledge that they've developed in order to help them survive. You think, you know, if you have lived in a context in which your survival is not guaranteed, you're going to be inventive, right? Right? If you don't have access to health care, you're going to find ways to help you be healthy. So that's what funds of knowledge is. Knowledge within the own community to help communities survive and to move on to the next generation. So healing, this is an important point. So when a young person heals his or her social identity, healing must occur not only on the individual self, but also in the community context. You must also address the social and economic toxins. Why? Why must you do that simultaneously? You're not really solving anything. It might be fractured again. You're not really solving anything. You may do good work in the school, helping young people connect to their identities, but they have to go home. Right? And as I said, I'm not thinking of home in a very micro sense. They have to go to a social context in which there might be poverty, lack of health care, high levels of unemployment, right? These are some of the conditions that could affect young people continuously over again. So, this idea of funds of knowledge. So, it's community knowledge, knowledge that has been developed over generations, and it's used for the survival so that you can maintain some sense of well-being. And I want to know, what do you think some of the funds of knowledge are in the Latinx community? What do you think they are? There's one that everyone says immediately. So, yeah, so entrepreneurship, yeah. There's one that immediately, what? Language, linguistic assets, yes. What else? Right, support where? Within the family, right? Everyone always says the family, right? There's support within the family. Funds of knowledge, right? These are all things that help to develop well-being, a positive sense of self, right? To help you survive in the world, to help you deal with the world. There are multiple forms of funds of knowledge. Just think of where does style come from? Style, clothes, music, style. Where does it come from? Right? Culture. Well, which generation? What? It's the younger generation. They're moving us in terms of the cultural style. They're moving us forward. They have been for generations. So that's a funds of knowledge. Art is a fund of knowledge. Culture, dance, music, all of those things are funds of knowledge, right? Because they all sort of connect into one's identity. And they all sort of produce a positive sense of self. So it's way more than just, the family's important. Also, language is important, but the creative things, the creative aspects that communities do is also a funds of knowledge. So the last level of awareness is global awareness. Awareness of others that exist outside of one's community. An awareness of how they might be suffering, and to be in solidarity with them. Now, I'll go into what that means, solidarity. But I'd like to talk about actually a student that's in a class that Carrie Romo and I teach. And the student gets it. She has those 3 different areas of awareness. Awareness of self. She's aware that she's a strong Latina. She's only 13 years old, right? She also is aware of her community context. She's aware that there are social and economic toxins. This particular student is undocumented. So she lives in fear of being deported, right? That adds incredible amounts of stress in her life. But she realizes that the only way to deal with that stress is to bring hope in her life. And her sense of hope is to speak out, protest, go to rallies, talk, use her voice in order to bring change. Right? That's how she brings hope into her life. And she realizes that her struggle is not the only struggle in the world. She has a global awareness. And that whatever she does might help other people beyond her own community. She gets that sense of solidarity. Now, solidarity, this is a quote by James Baldwin. I actually did a similar talk at Iowa State, and I got to James Baldwin, and it was, I have to mention this because it's kind of sad. I was talking to pre-service teachers, predominantly young people, college students. All of them were white. I asked them, do you know who James Baldwin is? Not one knew. One said an actor. it's kind of, for me, that's kind of sad. That's sad, because James Baldwin is one of the most important American writers in this country, right? And that they're going to be teachers, they don't know James Baldwin, is a shame. So anyway, he writes this letter. He writes this letter to Angela Davis, who was active in the struggle for civil rights. And she was in prison. And she was in death row. And he sends her this letter in solidarity with her. And he ends the letter with a solidarity statement. And I think this captures this idea of solidarity. If we know, then we must fight for your life as though it were our own, which it is, and render impassable with our bodies the corridor to the gas chambers. For if they take you in the morning, they will be coming for us that night. So it's the sense that your struggle is my struggle. Because whatever they do to you, they could do to me as well. It's important for people to grasp that. So, the social justice pathway to well-being. Healing fractured identities, challenge the social economic toxins in one's own community context, and build solidarity with other marginalized communities. So those are the three sort of steps to well-being. Now I have this sort of fancy table up here, the social justice awareness model. This will help us. I want to engage in an analysis and discussion of some content. I have some content, some videos, some literature, some music, and we're gonna talk about them. And I'm hoping we can talk about them in a sense of thinking of the self, the self, community context, and global reality. So if we can talk about them in this sort of social justice awareness model, just to see how these things are active, how these things are going. So there's, in terms of the self, there is a negative impact that could happen on the self, which we talked about that. Then there's a positive action, which is learning to feel a sort of positive sense of self. Then the community context, we also talk about social and economic toxins. And then healing through the funds of knowledge, the knowledge within one's own community. And a global reality is that you are aware that others are suffering, and then you initiate some solidarity with others. So we're going. Let me do an introduction. So what you're about to see is students protesting. Some of you might be off-put by that, because they get kind of rowdy. You might be off-put seeing young people yelling and screaming, using their voices. But you remember that civil disobedience, so they're actually engaged in civil disobedience. Remember, civil disobedience is an important part of the development of democracy in this country. We really wouldn't have civil rights in this country without civil disobedience. We celebrate Martin Luther King, but did you know that he was in jail for about 28, 29 times? Right? He broke the laws that were unjust laws, but he broke laws and he was put in jail. So these students, they were all in my social justice course in Arizona. They were all in the course. They learned about different youth movements, young people protesting, engaged in civil disobedience. They learned about it. I didn't tell them to go do this, but this was a part of their consciousness. This was their funds of knowledge. The history of resistance is a part of their funds of knowledge. So you might have to mirror it's not playing up there. Sometimes like the displays are not mirrored, or that's. It was playing before, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was. It was awesome.
Yeah. There we go. Okay, sorry about the technical difficulties. Yeah. Yeah.
Students in Tucson, Arizona took over a local school board meeting in order to prevent a controversial vote from taking place on the school district's ethnic studies program. 7 current Tucson high school students and 2 high school alumni chained themselves to the board chairs as a large crowd occupied the meeting room and held a rally. Tucson's unified school district has become a focal point in Arizona's heated debate over the future of its Mexican American Studies program after House Bill 2281, banning ethnic studies in public schools, was passed a week after the passage of the notorious anti-immigration bill, SB 1070. The action on Tuesday the 26th was planned by the student group Unidos, or United as Non-Discriminatory Individuals Demanding Our Studies, comprised mostly of Tucson high school students and alumni. Alyssa Mehta, an organizer with Unidos who participated in the occupation, explained some of the pressures that contributed to the students' decision to intervene with the meeting.
Since February, we've been just put on the back burner, kind of put away. We attend every school board meeting, and each time we always go to call to the audience, and we always address them. We have asked for meetings with them, and we've done civil discourse. We've done that. We've done it peacefully, and it seems each time that it just goes in one ear and out the other. On April 26th, the Tucson Unified School District wanted to pass a resolution that called for making Mexican American Studies courses elective courses instead of the core accredited courses that they originally account for and currently account for. This resolution was very, very last minute on their part, and it was completely against the stances that they've come out against HB 2281, and they claimed that it had nothing to do with the bill against ethnic studies, and the resolution was going to be voted on, and as we knew prior that 3 of the 5 board members were going to vote for the resolution to be passed, and only 2 of them were in support of us. So we were aware completely that if we didn't stop the vote from happening, that the classes would be turned into elective courses that wouldn't have been able to count as a core credit upon graduation for the students at the high schools.
There are concerns that if the ethnic studies program in Tucson was to become an elective course rather than a core credit course, it would be more difficult for students who need credit to graduate to take the classes, and that they could also be subject to proposed budget cuts in education that target elective courses. Former schools chief and current Attorney General Tom Horne introduced HB 2281 last year. The law prohibits courses that promote the overthrow of the United States government, promote resentment toward a race or class of people, are designed primarily for pupils of a particular ethnic group, and advocate ethnic solidarity instead of the treatment of pupils as individuals. Current Superintendent of Arizona Public Schools, John Hubenthal, has initiated a costly $170,000 audit Unified School District to determine if its Mexican American Studies program violates the new law, which could put 10% of the district's monthly funding at risk. There have been no similar proposals to change the status of core European history courses, while Tucson's Mexican American La Raza Studies program is considered by many to be a success, as demonstrated by impressive graduation and college attendance rates for course alumni and schools with higher dropout rates. A lawsuit has been filed questioning the constitutionality of HB 2281, while students from Morelos also questioned the legality of the school board's actions when they presented their own resolution during the occupation.
We want full compliance with our civil and human rights. The ban on ethnic studies is unconstitutional, dehumanizing, and is a violation of our human rights. According to Article 31 of the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples of 2007, we have the right to maintain, control, protect, and develop our cultural heritage, traditional knowledge, and traditional cultural expression.
Dr. Cornell West has referred to Tucson as the epicenter of the new civil rights movement, as comparisons are being made between Arizona and earlier struggles in the United States against racism and inequality. It's this simple notion that they are scared of a population they're trying to push down. They're scared of us empowering ourselves intellectually. This is the most successful program in all of TUSU's history. It's the only ethnic studies department in the entire nation and public schools that have had this much success and that are still in effect and have the most beautiful faculty to support it. And because it is a research-based program, it is substantial. It's intellectually substantial to this community. It is completely locally relevant. And to have that relevance in a city of Arizona that has so much history with border conflicts and private prisons and migra going everywhere and invading our streets, invading our homes, that it is no joke that this is just disempowerment of knowledge that we need to face what is happening politically in every other aspect of migrants' rights, undocumented rights, and everything. So it's just a piece of this racism. A wave of anti-immigration legislation has been introduced in a number of states in recent months, many laws mirroring Arizona's SB 1070, in spite of the fact that the law was found to be unconstitutional in federal court. Many states are also proposing profound changes to the public education system, with proposed privatization initiatives and a series of budget cuts that could have serious implications on the future of other ethnic studies programs, like the Mexican American Studies program in Tucson. If the nation has anything to learn from this, it's that Arizona is the beginning point of something sinister, something almost viral that can happen. And SB 1070 was the perfect example of that, and how quick other legislators grabbed a hold of this idea. And as legislatures across the country figured out that how quick they can get away with it, right under our noses, if we take away what happens in education. Arizona is authoritarian, and unless we fix that, unless we stop fearing it, then for the future, nothing else can change. The Tucson Unified School District meeting over the future of its Mexican American Studies program was rescheduled for May 5th, but then later moved to Tuesday, May 3rd, following public anger over the significance of scheduling a meeting on the Cinco de Mayo holiday. Authorities have announced that a number of heightened security measures will be in effect during the meeting. The youth of Unidos have vowed to continue their struggle to protect what they feel is a critical resource for their schools and communities. This is David Doherty with the Real News Network.
So that is an example of social justice education. As I said, all of those young people were in a class that I helped design, a social justice government course, and they learned from history about protests and the power behind protests, and that as a vehicle for using their democratic voice. So let's talk about this. What were the aspects of identity that were going on in what you just saw? Right, their history, right? Right? So what may be the social toxin that is sort of harming their sense of self, harming their identity? What do you think it was in that? Racism. But where was that racism coming from? What's that? Not the district, but the state government. They passed legislation to ban ethnic studies in my social justice course. And they were successful. But fortunately, from a lawsuit, they have removed the ban, right? Because it was unconstitutional. They were absolutely right. The young people were absolutely right. It's unconstitutional. You can't target a particular group of people. And they were targeting Mexican American studies. So you can't do that. That's unconstitutional. So what were some of the global aspects? Where did you see solidarity? The students, but remember the young woman she was reading almost a solidarity statement, right? Saying that UN Charter says that we have the right of indigenous people. So there's this global awareness as well. So there are, I know that I'm right, where am I at? Like, how much time do I have? 8 minutes? Okay, I gotta move it along. So here, that was just one example of social justice education. Social justice education can also come in the form of literature, right? So this is a very famous passage from a very famous book. I'll give you a prize if you can tell me what the name of the book is. Does anyone know what the name of this book is? What? This House on Mango Street, right? Right? House on Mango Street. So can someone read this first section here, this first paragraph?
In English, my name means hope. In Spanish, it means too many letters. It means sadness. It means waiting. It is like the number 9, a muddy color. It is the Mexican records my father plays on Sunday mornings when he is shaving. Songs like sobbing.
Okay, can someone read the second paragraph?
It was my great-grandmother's name, and now it is mine. She was a horse woman too, born like me in the Chinese year of the horse. This is supposed to be bad luck if you're born female. But I think this is a Chinese lie, because the Chinese, like the Mexicans, don't like their women strong.
Yeah. So what are the aspects of identity in this poem? Or it's actually passage. What are the aspects of identity? The name, right? The name. The name that she actually gets from heritage, right? From her grandmother. What is the social toxin that she is sort of struggling with? Well, too many letters. Yeah. Sexism. She's dealing with sexism because Mexicans, like the Chinese, don't like their women strong. And then there's a global awareness, a global solidarity. She's in solidarity with the Chinese culture, Chinese people. So this is different ways to think and analyze and bring out the social justice content. Now I need to move along. Dance is actually a cultural power, right? And I didn't realize that until I went to a Latinx graduation here in Des Moines, went to a graduation, and they were playing music, and they were playing cumbias and rancheros and huapangos and zapateado. They were so into dancing, and they danced in a circle, and they danced counterclockwise. Right? And I did research. I researched, well, what is it with the circle and what is it dancing counterclockwise? I came across a colleague of mine, Chicana feminist by the name of Yolanda Broiles Gonzalez, and she writes a chapter on dance and its sort of spiritual, cultural meaning. And she says that dancing in a circle and dancing counterclockwise is an indigenous practice. So remember I said that young people sometimes are unaware of the assets that they have? They're very unaware that they were doing something that has history behind it. So why do you think the counterclockwise movement? Why do you think, in terms of indigenous practice, you move counterclockwise? Something, they are in solidarity with something that is really huge that moves counterclockwise, that rotates counterclockwise. What? No, it's the sun doesn't rotate, does it? Does it rotate? I'm not a science person. It's the earth. The earth rotates counterclockwise. So they are in harmony, they are in sync with the earth by doing this. Now this is important. I believe that dance is a form of social justice education because you what? You reflect positively on yourself because you connect to a culture, a rich culture, right? You also heal from any type of social toxins that you might have because what does dance do? What does it bring into your life? Joy. Absolutely. And then you're in solidarity. You're in solidarity with the other folks. You're in solidarity with the folks that make the music, right, in other communities. And you're in solidarity with the earth. Now, why is that so important to be in solidarity with the earth? That's the next level of, that's not on my awareness model, but that's the next level. Why is it so important to be in solidarity with the earth? Right. I mean, unfortunately, folks, we humans are doing a lot of damage to this earth. So what's the point of having the positive, sense of self when the earth, the larger context in which you live, is being destroyed? So that sort of solidarity is very important, being connected to the earth. So we are going to do this. We're going to dance. We're going to dance in a circle and go counterclockwise. I know some of you going, oh, I don't want to dance. Believe me, you want to dance because you're going to feel the energy. You're going to be in solidarity with each other. So it's the last slide. So that's yeah. So counterclockwise is, it's this way, right? It's this way. Yeah. So come on over. Circle up. Just one big circle. See if you can. Can we get the volume up a little more? Okay. All right. Start moving this way. Start moving. Come on. We're going to turn up the volume.